To return once again to the development of the individual person from infancy to full reflective self-consciousness at around 14 or 15. Reason, of course, begins to operate sooner, but it's the capacity of the child to recognize not just notionally, but experientially the difference between right and wrong is probably very problematic until about 14 or 15, at which time the brain is ready to go, is developed enough to go into the intuitive levels of consciousness. And hence the child at 16, 17 has a period there where it's extremely open to values and meaning. And yet this is the period when education makes the highest demands, and there's no real structure for young people to face the full consequences of the questions that are rising in them, of which the chief is, where are you? And so most young people rush into a professional life and their social life and plan a family and make money and get a house and get a mortgage and try the stock market and all of which is absolutely secondary stuff compared to answering the fundamental question of the first part of the spiritual journey. So let's look at what happens in that course of development when the presence of God, which at least points to what true happiness is missing. And that is the real basis of the consequences of original sin. They're the consequences of not knowing who God is experientially. And this is just not part of the growing up process. It must be part of God's plan. So there's some good in it. Maybe God figured out that having made Adam and Eve sort of perfect, and then they wanted to be gods too, and they fell into pride. Maybe he decided he wasn't going to make that mistake again. And so he lets everybody just evolve from scratch, so that by the time we do choose the spiritual journey, we know that whatever goodness and virtue we have is not coming from us, and that basically our lives are unmanageable. So fundamental. In other words, we're all desperately ill. Desperately ill. And the false self, and the disease is the false self, and eventually it will kill you. My proof for that statement is that everybody, as far as I know, dies. And so I submit that the false self is a serious illness if it kills you. So everybody then starts out in the woods with desperate search for forms of happiness that will fill the void that is experienced of security, power, control, or freedom, and self-worth or affirmation. And here, of course, it's a little difficult to make all the distinctions necessary in a short discussion. But it is an important aspect of the spiritual journey to develop the self-consciousness that is merging stage by stage. First the body self, and then the self as separate from the body. So that in adolescence one is developing a genuine self-identity. This is one of the problems of that period of life. People don't know who they are, and they're trying to find an identity, and some people say it's this and that, and they join a group, a peer group, a gang, or something, to give them an identity that they don't feel in themselves. So an education that brings people to ego strength, as the psychologists would say, is a positive element of growth, and the false self with its is not an unmixed blessing, or I should say not an unmixed disaster. It simply doesn't go far enough, and while it has a certain value in early infancy to help us to survive, we're supposed to grow out of it. The problem is practically no one does. And we don't know how to go about it either. So just in this group, you've read a lot of psychology, I'm sure. You know what codependency is, what the family systems theory is, what a dysfunctional family is. According to some writers in that school of thought, 98% of people in the West come from dysfunctional families. I don't know about the East. I suspect it's similar. In any case, who are these other 2% who are so healthy? I've never met anyone in that category myself. And that's why I can easily adhere through experience to the Church's teaching that everybody is afflicted by original sin or the fall. In any case, suppose one's security needs are severely hindered as an infant. In other words, the parents are missing. The mother is in the hospital for a long time, which the child registers as rejection. Perhaps the child was never wanted, perhaps was dumped on the steps of an orphanage. There it had to compete for its affection needs with a whole bunch of other people and a staff too small to provide. Hence, they're coming to full self-consciousness with a whole baggage load of needs that are unfulfilled, and the frustration of needs that have set off afflictive emotions. The way this seems to work is that you have an energy center, that is an investment in power control, let us say. And now you're confined to an institution, an orphanage or something, with no way of expressing it. One is fighting always, one runs away, one tries to escape, one disobeys, all the things the child does to desperately assert its some degree of independence at least. And it's constant frustration. When the frustration goes off, then comes, depending on the temperament or the number on the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or whatever your self-help standard is, whatever it is, off goes absolutely certainly anger, grief, apathy, depression, lust in the sense of compensation through an exaggeration of food or drink or sex, pride in the sense of exaggeration of intellectual excellence, prestige, status, control. In the tradition of the Desert Fathers, they had 8 what they called capital sins, which were not sins as such, but tendencies, when they got strong enough or stimulated enough by frustration, would end up in deeds that reflected envy, which were disastrous to other people or themselves. So this doctrine of the thoughts is quite a valuable patrimony from that early period of experience of the first forms of monastic life in the 3rd and 4th century. Anger means hostility and the desire for revenge. We must distinguish here the passion of anger from the energy of anger, which should never be suppressed because it's very valuable energy in itself. This is where, again, all the basic energies of human nature are good. It's just that they have been distorted by the not knowing how to order them to the ultimate happiness in such a way that the energy centers become substitutes for happiness, substitutes for God in growing up. And hence, one hangs on to them very deeply. And the emotional trauma of frustration that we experience in early childhood with regard to the frustration of achieving any one of those energy centers by way of gratification is stored in the body as a kind of warehouse. And modern medicine is discovering that, I read somewhere, that every experience of life is recorded somewhere in the body, either in the brain and the chips there, or in the nervous system or the body. And some traumas are stored in various particular parts of the body, anger. And you can see people who are carrying a load of something, sometimes by their posture or by their expression and so on. But everybody's carrying some, because no one gets through childhood without a lot of these experiences of frustration. And there's no way of processing them when you're 1 or 2, because you don't have the language to talk to your parents or the doctor or whoever you know, or your friends. And you don't know what's happening, so there's just sheer pain. Hence, primitive emotions are stored in the body as energy. Hence, they oppose the free flow of energy. And since the body, mind, spirit is a continuum, they influence our decisions, including important ones, all through life until we take ourselves in hand with the 12-step program, or the spiritual journey in one of the great spiritual traditions of the world religions. Centering prayer happens to be representative of the Christian way of looking at this. But it's in dialogue with science and with the other world religions, which I don't think every practice is yet. So I think all the world religions have to confront the scientific information from psychology and quantum mechanics today, because they're so critical in understanding the spiritual journey. Now, the greatest contribution for the spiritual journey, I venture to say, or well put it, one of the very greatest, is the discovery only 100 and some years ago by Freud of the unconscious. Now, the great mystics have always intuited it in some degree, but to bring it out of the closet, so to speak, in a way that you can look at it, and to see through the modern psychological developments like the dysfunctional family, which details what the consequences of the fall are in words that are very understandable and concrete. Like every family in the family theories thing has a scapegoat. Okay. Another has the gesture, and this is passed on from generation to generation. Well, with that information, you can be alerted to the fact that there must be some inclinations deeply in your own psyche that you don't even quite know yet or haven't confronted, that predispose you for that role, and that to be yourself, which is the second phase of the spiritual journey, and that might be summed up in the question, who are you? This, once you've found out where you are, then comes who are you? And you see this could fit into the 12 steps easy enough. The first steps are designed to help you find out who you are, the inventory, the willingness to change your defects. And then the 11th step, which is the introduction into this spiritual identity that we are. And hence, the higher levels of consciousness, from the intuitive to the unitive to unity consciousness and beyond, if such beyond states exist, are about who we really are. And they involve letting go of the ego self that you've spent half a lifetime developing, and surrendering that to God and discovering that the true self, in a sense, is God in the sense of manifesting the unique idea that God had of us from the beginning, which is a communication of His being in your uniqueness. This level of consciousness is absolutely awesome, obviously. But here we are at the beginning of the journey, pounded and frustrated by the by feelings of rejection, inadequacy, competition, jealousy, sibling rivalry, talents that are unfulfilled, having to sit in a schoolroom, fear of other people, entering a gang for protection or identity, loss of our friends, relatives, all the human conditions, not to mention occasional disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes. All of this is like being in a potentially hostile universe for the child, which has no inner resources to deal with this. Hence, it has to create them. And thus, we begin to develop what might be called the homemade self. The homemade self is what we do to try to find gratification in one of those energy centers, and how to avoid the pain of the frustration that inevitably occurs as we enter into social relationships, and then as life gets more complex in adult life. But one of the advantages as well as disadvantages of adult life is there's so much to do there and there's so much responsibility that you forget about the whole damn problem for a long time, until nature, supporting God's plan, begins to raise some questions of its own as you get into the midlife crisis, go through a few divorces, in a few rehabs, into a few bankruptcies. Then maybe then if that doesn't work, you move into old age and senility and Alzheimer's, and finally you wind up on your deathbed in some crummy old folks' home, surrounded by relatives who are after your money, and surrounded by doctors who don't know what to do with you anymore. Psychiatrists have given up, and finally you say, well, maybe my emotional programs for happiness were not so hot after all. Whereupon, in God's infinite mercy, you die happy and enter into heaven. But I suggest there's a better way of doing that. Or I didn't suggest it. It's the gospel of Jesus, if you understand it, it seems to me, is first of all an invitation to grow up, to question your value system, to question the social values in which you're living in your environment, and to address seriously the emotional programs for happiness, for approval, affectionacy. Here's where the first words that Jesus says is, repent. That does not mean you striking your breast or afflicting yourself with fasting or beating yourself with razor blades or something, as some saints thought was necessary to cure their problems. It means, very simply, change the direction in which you're looking for happiness. That is, question whether you will really find happiness in those energy centers that are deeply in place and which you're pursuing at a great rate, and which, when they're frustrated, which is every day, by triggering circumstances, off go instantly, because of the way human nature is built, instantly goes off the afflictive emotions that's appropriate to the situation. Anger, grief, discouragement, despair, rejection, all these things. And then off go the commentaries, because on the level of our imagination and feelings, the two are in cahoots. There's a combo between them, a contract. And so they're like the two wheels of an old clock that interlock. So that as soon as you have any upsetting emotion, it affects the body in some way, but it sets off the emotions, which in turn set off the commentaries, the pre-recorded tapes that we've developed over a lifetime to respond to frustrating situations. So let's just take anger, for instance. We feel we've been mistreated by someone at the office, and maybe we were. Off goes the feeling of anger. in the background with anger is always revenge. I'll get my way somewhere. I'll get back at this person. I'll stick him with a knife in the back. Or I'll get him fired or so. So the commentaries start going, and as they start going, they reinforce the feeling so that irritation or anger develops into, from annoyance to anger, to rage, to fury, to temporary insanity, so that eventually you say, why don't they fire this guy? And then, no, let me wring his neck with my bare hands. And so this kind of a binge then is not healthy. And instead of dealing with it, we get home, everybody looks at our face, they head for the doors and windows, nobody can eat at meals, we can't sleep at night, we take drugs, we awake thinking about this all night, and in the morning we're terribly fatigued and drained, we say, well, why did I get so angry over that? Unfortunately, sometimes frustrating experience lasts a few days, a few weeks, and I've known people that never got over it. And of course it can lead to violence, both individual, social, and national. Hence, this is no joke. We have to face the false self-system and start to dismantle it. Otherwise, we will contribute to the general malaise of society just by who we are. We haven't discovered where we are, and so unwittingly we feed into and reinforce the false values of the culture and society that are literally killing people, or at least leading to ever greater oppression of the needy and the poor. So there are various ways of reacting to frustration, all of them afflictive and unhealthy. And every time we give in to one of them, it reinforces the energy center in the unconscious, so that it just makes things worse, and hence it adds to the intensity of the addictive process and makes it more likely that as time goes on, we will ourselves fall into an addictive process because of the pain that we haven't either faced or handled well. We react, of course, emotionally under the influence of our perhaps genetic constitution, or our temperament, as they used to say, or our number on the Enneagram. Karen Horney, who really has the greatest examination of consciousness I ever saw. She divides the human response to difficulties into a program to fulfill our idealized image of ourselves and of happiness for us. And this is leads to neurosis, and is quite a job to dismantle that. But she suggests that people react to frustration by withdrawal. They go and hide in the closet upstairs if they're a child. Or by aggression, they punch the other infant in the nose. Or by dependency, by going to mom or dad and say, fix this problem. And hence, none of these reactions to reality are mature. They're the reactions of a child. But self-knowledge develops. We see that we have an inclination to do the same thing if we had a chance. And so the ways of expressing one's emotional program are as varied as human nature. Materialistic, just to run through them briefly. There's, of course, workaholism, possessiveness, wealth, money, and property, luxurious food and drink, sexual activity. On the emotional level, there's people-pleasing. There's emotional exchange that we feel we have to have. Popularity, satisfying relationships, sexual misconduct, certain kinds of music. Intellectual level, we might experience the demand for academic excellence, for preferring the tenure to truly creative development. The need to be always right is a fairly frequent one. Social expressions of the frustrations of our energy centers are of course, status, prestige, racism, nationalism, religious bigotry, triumphalism, forms of domination, authoritarianism, and so on. And in religious circles, there is legalism, Pharisaism, hypocrisy, putting up a good front, cults when it gets bad enough, and finally on the spiritual level, there's attachment to psychic powers if one is into the intuitive level of consciousness. I am not getting into those higher levels of consciousness, but intuitive is the one that we may be moving into as a fairly frequent level of consciousness, and a lot of people have psychic powers today, so much that you wonder if this isn't a movement. But it doesn't affect the false self system. It's the level of faith, it's the level at which centering prayer begins. But psychic powers have the tendency, unless the false self has been diminished first, of simply becoming spiritual pride or spiritual triumphalism. Even when, you can see auras or you can work miracles and so on. So the spiritual journey has always been about the transformation of the self, not what we can do for others that makes us a center of admiration or, at worst, a cult. But even attachment to spiritual consolations is a significant hindrance and is a manifestation of the false self. So that in just thinking about the psychological content of our prayer in terms of consolation or desolation is itself a sign that we have some more work to do in demolishing what lays at root of all those manifestations of frustration, which is our attachment or the energy we put into, consciously or unconsciously, the false self with its programs for happiness that are basically emotional and infantile, and over-identification with our cultural conditioning and the kind of support we get from a group or belonging to a group that is excessive and that prevents us from asserting our true individuality and of being truly loyal and honest to ourselves and to other people. Integrity, in other words, is the movement towards being oneself and not dominated by the opinions or values of others, except insofar as you freely decide that these are the best.